I'm very excited to talk about this topic with the coronation coming up. I think there's a lot of talk about Charles's beliefs and philosophies, a lot of kind of a mixed picture, I think it's safe to say. So I want to talk a bit about that. I suppose just a disclaimer, I don't want to make any grand claims about the King's beliefs or philosophy, and this is more of a speculative exercise, but nonetheless one which I've tried my very hardest to be grounded in things that he's said, speeches he's given, and his own book. So it's really a sort of, it's inspired by all of that material. And it's based on that. So I think without further ado, I'll start with a quote from His Majesty given in 2006, so quite a while ago now. And that is this: "The loss of tradition cuts to the very core of our being, since it conditions that which we can know and be. For modernism, by its unrelenting emphasis on the quantitative view of reality, limits and distorts the true nature of the real and our perception of it. Whilst it has enabled us to know much that has been of material benefit, it also prevents us from knowing that which I would like to refer to as our knowledge of the heart, that which enables us to be fully human." So when it comes to His Majesty, I think we're often presented with a somewhat mixed picture. On the one hand, he seems to be quite a staunch defender of tradition. If you listen to these quotes that he's given, such as in the passage I just read out now, he's clearly somebody who is deeply invested in the values and cultures of pre-modern civilization, and clearly articulates that in a language of somebody who is philosophically engaged with the nature of tradition and modernity. And so that's evident in these speeches that he's given at such conferences, but also in more subtle engagements of Charles. So, for example, his involvement with the Temenos Academy. I have quite a few people who I know through the Temenos Academy here today. So that's been one of his major activities, I suppose, as the Prince of Wales, which is a school for the study of traditional wisdom, and much of which centres around Plato and the Platonic tradition. In addition to that, you also have the Prince's School of Traditional Arts, which is, again, a centre dedicated to the study of traditional wisdom in the form of visual culture. They do everything from calligraphy to icon painting. They do some of the most incredible courses there, so I've heard. So all of these things seem to point to a deep reverence of tradition and that which we've lost in the modern world, and he's been quite vocal about that. But then on the other hand, His Majesty sometimes gets accused of what you might call modernist heresies. Unfortunately, in the media, there is sometimes criticism about his commitment to environmentalism and his vocal celebration of diversity and pluralism, which some people feel to be a kind of gesture towards relativistic multiculturalism, which was a piece that was recently published in the Catholic Herald by Gavin Ashenden, who took a very critical stance on the King's inaugural Christmas speech. So, as I say, it's a kind of mixed picture, if you like. Perhaps the most difficult to grasp, and indeed the most controversial, are His Majesty's views on faith, which again seem to point to a kind of complex mixture of tradition and modernity. So famously, and some infamously, in 1994, he quite controversially suggested that when king, he might become defender of faith, as opposed to defender of the faith, with the definite article, as Queen Elizabeth II issued, which some took as a gesture towards pluralism, or even relativism, or maybe just a reluctance to assert his Christianity in the face of a multicultural society. And then adding to this suspicion, there's also a very clearly deep appreciation of other religions. Orthodox Christianity is one which Charles has clearly been deeply involved with over the years and has expressed an admiration for, but also Islam. And perhaps most famously, he gave a talk at the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford back in 1993, where he praised Muslim society in Britain, and even went so far as to say that Islam can teach us a way of understanding and living in the world which Christianity itself is poorer for having lost. So that was from a speech called Islam in the West at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies at the Sheldonian. So now he's become king, it does seem that His Majesty will assume the traditional title of Defender of the Faith. But he's clearly nonetheless continued to hold other faith traditions in very high esteem. In his inaugural Christmas speech, he was praising not only the contributions of churches, but also synagogues, mosques, temples, gurdwaras, and is clearly very committed to this. He had a meeting with representatives of different faiths very shortly after the death of his mother. So this is clearly a priority for him, and clearly there seems to be an appreciation of all religions and not just Christianity. So what does this mean? Because on the surface, it might seem to, as I say, point to some kind of relativism or universalism, or just an appeal to this secular age in which the exclusivity of Christianity has to be sacrificed to the cause of equal toleration and respect for all beliefs. And in that context, it becomes difficult to affirm one's devout commitment to Anglicanism. None of this is necessarily untrue, but I think it's a lot more nuanced, and that's what I want to talk about today. So that quote that I read out in the beginning was from His Majesty's speech, then the Prince of Wales, at a conference for Sacred Web, which is unfortunately now discontinued journal for the study of perennial philosophy. And this is a school of thought which His Majesty has been involved with for decades. Perennial philosophy, to offer a probably limited definition, can be broadly understood as the view that different spiritual traditions are exoteric manifestations of one esoteric body of truths. But this view itself also has a number of manifestations, if you like. On the one hand, you have Huxley, you have the more New Age end of the spectrum, which tends to sort of see all religions as equally valid. Messiah Eliade, for example, is a good representative of that tradition. But I want to explore how specifically His Majesty seems to sympathise with a particular branch of perennial philosophy known as the traditionalist school. Now, this is primarily associated with a 20th century thinker called René Guénon, whose books include A Crisis of the Modern World and The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. Now, if you notice in that opening quote, His Majesty actually referred to the quantitative nature of modernity, which I think, given the context of a perennial philosophy conference, was almost certainly a reference to the reign of quantity. And indeed, in other speeches, he has made explicit reference to René Guénon. So what is traditionalist perennialism? So Guénon and the rest of the traditionalists, who include Ananda Kumaraswamy, Christoph Schuon, to name the most three prominent of this particular branch of traditionalist perennialism, they saw the modern world defined by materialism, individualism, and liberalism as being severed from the metaphysical reality to which human beings had, in their opinion, once been connected through tradition with a capital T, which doesn't refer specifically to any particular set of rites or necessarily any one tradition, but rather to the spirit, or what they understand to be the spirit of pre-modern civilizations, which, according to Guénon, as he says in The Reign of Quantity, were oriented vertically towards transcendence rather than being stuck on the horizontal plane of immanence. So the idea of a vertical society is one which has the divine as its utmost teleology, I suppose. Whereas modernity for Guénon and the traditionalists is one that has been completely severed from that higher reality and is now concerned with purely material affairs. So a good example of that is knowledge, and the very notion of knowledge, which is again something which His Majesty is alluding to right in that opening quote, whereby traditional pre-modern systems of knowledge were always oriented towards an understanding of something which was beyond the physical world. Whereas in the modern world, it's all on the kind of horizontal. So it's about maths and sciences, engineering, which are all valuable. But the point is that they remain on that immanent plane. And I think the modern monomania with STEM, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but over humanities is I suppose just one example of that. Now, in terms of how to reconnect to tradition, this is where it gets a bit more interesting, I think. Because as I say, by capitalized tradition, they're referring to a spirit rather than any one particular set of rites. So for Guénon, he decided to choose the tradition which he believed was the least corrupted by modernity, which for him was Islam. So I think it's safe to say that for Guénon, his conversion was perhaps more pragmatic rather than necessarily theological. He saw it as being, well, Muslim civilizations are the ones which are the least removed from transcendence. They clearly retained an order and a structure which connects them to the divine. And so he moved to Egypt and became a Sufi Muslim. They were also, however, very, very critical of what you might call kind of modern relativism and New Age universalism. And they actually saw this as just another symptom of modernity, and I'll go into that later. I think it's important to highlight right from the get-go that even though they see different spiritual traditions as being potentially valid, this was by no means an invitation to syncretism or the mixing and merging of different religions. And Guénon wrote biting critiques of what he called counter-traditions, which were spiritual movements, most prominently the Theosophical Society, which he believed were blending too many different religious ideas together and were actually removing the concept of initiation, which again is extremely important. If you lose the initiative aspect of tradition, then there can be no spiritual insight gleaned from it. So they're extremely against syncretism. So what I want to argue then of traditionalism is that, yes, it represents some kind of pluralism, but it's a kind of pluralism within limits. It doesn't posit that just any belief system is valid or everything's equal. It has to be focused on this idealization of tradition and what is tradition. So here's another quote from His Majesty on the traditionalists, also at the Sacred Web Conference, where he says of traditionalists that their teachings should not in any sense be taken to mean that they seek, as it were, to repeat the past, or indeed simply to draw a distinction between the present and the past. Theirs is not a nostalgia for the past, but a yearning for the sacred. And if they defend the past, it is because in the pre-modern world, all civilizations were marked by the presence of the sacred, which I think is about the strongest testimony you can get of some sympathy of this perennialist gesture. So cynics might claim that perennialism is itself a very modern ideology, because after all, it is a reaction against, and I would argue, therefore, to some extent, a product of the 20th century. Guénon is reacting to the vastly the Industrial Revolution, which is vastly changing its surroundings, and it is a very, I think it's safe to say it is in some ways a reactionary movement. But I want to argue perennialism has much older origins, beginning in the European Renaissance, which was in turn influenced by the philosophy of Plato, or at least certain interpretations of Plato. So in this talk, I'm going to draw parallels between King Charles III's philosophy and these early forms of Neoplatonic perennialism during the Renaissance, beginning with Nicholas of Cusa and ending with Jean Bodin. So some people have probably come across this analogy of perennialism before. If not, you'll associate it with Pink Floyd. This is a very common metaphor, basically, for how the philosophy of perennialism works. So there's this idea that there is a kind of universal light. Well, before I get to that, I should just say that this is really a Neoplatonic idea of the universal in particular. So it's the idea of universals manifesting in particular ways. So in terms of this prism analogy, if you imagine the singular beam of light that's coming in on the side as representing a divine revelation, and I'll talk a bit about how different thinkers envision that and what it actually is soon. If you imagine that singular beam of light shining onto a prism, which is the world, by way of diffraction, this causes the light to take on the appearance of several individuated colours, which would represent different religions. So that's one metaphor, basically, for understanding how perennialism might work. And I think it's actually a very powerful metaphor because it encompasses the fact that perennialism is at the same time both pluralist, but ultimately exclusivist, in the sense that multiple religions can equally be expressions of some ultimate truth. But that truth ultimately remains singular. It's deriving from a single beam of light. And I'm not the first person to have this understanding of a kind of exclusivism and pluralism going on at the same time. It actually goes back to German theologian Nicholas of Cusa, who in 1453 wrote a treatise called De Pace Fide, in which he defends religious tolerance precisely on the premise that diverse rites and religions are all differentiated manifestations of the one true religion. And this is an approach which two scholars, Aiken and Alexander, have described as a kind of meta-exclusivism. It's sort of halfway between exclusivism and pluralism. So what does that entail? So basically for Cusa, there is one true religion, and that is Christianity, but it's specifically the ideal form of Christianity. Now, anyone who knows anything about Nicholas of Cusa's theology will know that it's characterized by a deep humility, the sense that we can never fully know God, a kind of the idea of sort of the hidden God. And so for Cusa, even though practicing Christians are trying to realize the ideal form of faith, even they are merely attempting. I mean, it's really an attempt that in this life we can only kind of can never fully realize it. And this, for Nicholas of Cusa, is, as I say, a deep kind of humility, which leads him to say that no, we actually should engage with other religious traditions, and we shouldn't reject all that they have to say, because indeed we're actually all searching for the same true religion. So this idea of theological humility is related to his Doctor Ignorantia. So it's all about kind of ignorance and what we can and can't know. And so from that perspective, even if Christians are coming the closest to this ideal form of religion, which is what Nicholas of Cusa believes, this doesn't preclude their appreciation of other religious traditions, because in theory they are all seeking the same ultimate truth, or the same light. And Nicholas of Cusa says himself in De Pace Fide that since truth is one, and since it is not possible that it not be understood by every free intellect, all diversity of religions will be led to one orthodox faith. So I'm just going to read out what Scott Aiken and Jason Alexander have interpreted of this, which they, as I say, describe as a kind of meta-exclusivism. So in holding this, Nicholas of Cusa insists that we owe the theological respect to all of the varied historical rites, because their very purpose in this world presupposes dependence on a singular true faith in which they all partake. Consequently, Nicholas offers, on the one hand, a pluralistic call for mutual respect and dialogue between the representatives of the world religions on the basis of their participation in a singular faith. But on the other hand, Nicholas, in noting that the one true religion is presupposed in the diversity of rites, holds that each religion, though seemingly inconsistent with its competitors, is right in its own unique way of relating its practitioners to the one true religion. So I think this perfectly encompasses this notion that for Nicholas of Cusa, there is one true faith, there is no doubt about that, but nonetheless, it's possible for people to participate in that faith in different ways. And for him, this is an invitation, particularly following the fall of Constantinople, which is really the context in which this is written. That's an opportunity for Christians to talk to Muslims and Jews in particular about their ultimate similarities and the sort of what they are all ultimately looking for as being a shared goal, if you like. So this is an idea which, as I say, is emerging very, very early on. This is 1453. So I think the idea that this notion that there is a degree of truth in multiple different religions is by no means an invention of the 20th century, which sometimes it does get assumed to be. So that's Nicholas of Cusa, who I think starts this way of looking at religious pluralism. But perhaps most famously, you have Marcello Ficino, who was writing in 15th century Italy, and he was a Neoplatonic philosopher and Catholic priest. And he devised a similar but different in important ways, kind of meta-exclusivism of his own, according to which there is a single chord of divine wisdom which can be found woven into the belief systems of all times, places, and cultures, including ancient paganism. And this doctrine is known as the Prissa Theologia. And this is defined as the doctrine that asserts that a single true theology exists, which threads through all religions and which was anciently given to God by humans. So for Ficino, the Prissa Theologia not only explains how you see recurrences in ancient religions and similarities across all of the world's cultures, but it also actually anticipates Christianity in the sense that he basically believed that the biblical magi had actually been recipients of the Prissa Theologia, this ancient primordial wisdom, which had given them the intuitions and the astrological knowledge to know that Christ was going to be born under the star of Bethlehem, which I think is a really fascinating theory. And you can see how he uses this idea of a sort of pre-Christian wisdom to explain these indeed pre-Christian events and how ancient paganism, there is clearly some continuity there. He's also, of course, Platonist, so that is also a justification for how so much of what we see in Plato resonates with Christianity. So I think it's worth pointing out that where's the line between a sort of revealed tradition and a natural religion? Because that is slightly ambiguous, I think, with Marsilio Ficino, because he describes Prisa Theologia in the language of revelation. But then given that this revelation is seemingly universal, it almost seems to anticipate a kind of natural religion, or something which people have always been endowed with since the beginning of time, which will be quite relevant when we move on to our next thinker. So in any case, there's the implication here that this true religion, this single true theology, has been implanted within human beings of all ages. And this would explain how, to go back to His Majesty's own saying, the presence of the sacred can be found in all traditional civilizations. Perhaps they were all recipients of this preserved theologia. Nonetheless, though, as with Cusa's single orthodox faith, Ficino's Prisa Theologia, it does assume its perfected form in Christianity. So it still asserts Christianity as being the ideal religion, but nonetheless allows for glimmers of that religion to be present elsewhere. So I think it's important to emphasize that it is still meta-exclusivistic, I can't tongue twister, because it's one light and one thread, and so ultimately one true religion. So I point these two thinkers out then because it shows that in both the Northern and the Southern Renaissance, as early as that, we find prototypes of what is essentially a kind of perennialism, but one which rests on a distinctly Neoplatonic notion of a universality, which accepts the partial validity of other religions, the idea that they are diffractions of the one true light, while still accepting that Christianity is perhaps the brightest of those diffractions, or purest, or it's still very much giving precedence to Christianity as the true faith. That all gets very interesting when we turn to Jean Bodin, who anyone who follows me on Twitter will know I've just been posting loads of things about Jean Bodin because I find him an absolutely fascinating thinker and extremely relevant, I think, to His Majesty and his way of looking at religion and sovereignty. So this Neoplatonic Renaissance paradigm of religious pluralism, which I've been talking about, takes on a very rarefied form in the writings of Jean Bodin, who is a 16th century French philosopher, and he was essentially trying to prove the existence of a universal religion or universal faith, following the context of the wars of religion. This is obviously a time of very violent, bloody sectarian conflict. It's no surprise really that the response of some people to that was to seek some common denominator that could unite people of different traditions. And he wasn't the only one. There are others around this time trying to turn to a kind of natural philosophy or natural theology, as opposed to revealed traditions, seeing that as being the antidote to these sectarian conflicts. So unlike Cusa and Ficino, it's worth saying that Bodin's conviction of Christianity as the ideal form of religion gets a little bit more ambiguous. So he publicly professed Catholicism. I think there's plenty of ground to believe that he was in fact a Catholic, but he was actually also accused of secretly converting to Judaism. One of the reasons for this is that he curiously hardly ever references the New Testament in any of his works. It's basically all Old Testament. Whether there's any more evidence for him converting to Judaism, I'm not sure. I don't think it's particularly likely. But in any case, his assertion of Christianity as being the one true faith, unlike Cusa and Ficino, does get slightly it's slightly more ambiguous. Instead, he places considerably more emphasis on the esoteric unity of all religions. And this is expressed in an incredibly fascinating work called The Colloquium of the Seven about Secrets of the Sublime, which is basically a 16th century interfaith dialogue, but an incredibly arcane and hermetic, I mean, literally and figuratively, one. And it's depicted in this illustration, which looks remarkably like a Leonora Carrington painting. It isn't, but it does. So these are the 7 participants sat around having an interfaith dialogue, basically. And they're in the house of Cornelius, who is Catholic. He's the host, and he's hosting them for 7 days. I think it's seven people, 7 days, so it's all numerically significant. So it's Cornelius the Catholic, and he is hosting Salomon the Jew, Octavius the Muslim, Torralba the philosophic naturalist, sometimes called a deist, but I don't think that's accurate. I think philosophic naturalist would go with that. Fredericcus the Lutheran, Curtius the Calvinist, and Synamus the skeptic. So it's a very weighty volume, which records that would be a great film actually, or play. It just goes into detail of their conversations. They talk about all sorts of things from the incarnation, icons, sacraments, all of the really, it's not a simplistic account of the similarities between religions, and actually it's often very unclear what Baudin's own views are. It's a kind of Socratic dialogue, or heptalogue, if that's a word. So, as I say, this colloquium is saturated with these quite sort of hermetic and Neoplatonic ideas. It's full of numerical symbolism. So, for example, Cornelius has 6 of everything in his house. He has 6 sets of drawers, 6 apples on the table. It's all very kind of coded. And I think there should probably be more work on it, because to date there's only one English translation and commentary, which is by Daniels Kuntz. And he cites Plotinus, Proclus, Augustine, Dionysius, and Ibn Sina as all being influences on Baudin. So this is clearly a very eclectic thinker. And the central premise, as I've probably already kind of conveyed, is that each of these 7 traditions, maybe 7 colours of the rainbow, maybe that's to go back to the metaphor at the beginning, have the same esoteric truths at their core. Not to deny the major differences, but they ultimately are emanations of some ultimate true religion. But precisely by virtue of being esoteric, these truths are only known to those with the highest intellectual caliber, who can see beyond the exoteric differences. So he's clearly, these 7 characters somehow all seem to know Plato and Plotinus inside out, so they're very well versed in these esoteric traditions. So there is this very clear philosopher king type of setup, basically, where it's the most refined of all of these different religions coming together and trying to seek out the most profound truths which they all share. So upon reading it, it sort of gets drawn out that the one true religion is actually a kind of natural religion. It's something which all human beings naturally possess, whether that's through intuition or reason. That's a whole other debate. But this is conveyed through the character of Torralba, who is the philosophic naturalist, who says, "The best and most ancient religion of all was implanted in human minds with right reasons by eternal God. And this religion proposes the one eternal God as the object of man's worship," which is an idea that you see more of later, particularly as you move into the Enlightenment. So Lord Herbert of Sherbury is perhaps the most famous example of someone who actually then rejects revelation, or rather undermines the need for revelation, because he says, all human beings are endowed with common notions, and we can know the principles of religion through these intuitive common notions. Anyway, Baudin is not saying that, and I'll explain why shortly. But nonetheless, there is this idea that there is ultimately some kind of natural religion. There is something within human beings which has an inclination towards God and seeks to worship God. But despite this, Baudin is insistent that the true religion cannot just be this abstract set of philosophical intuitions. It has to take on particular forms. And this is because in true Renaissance Neoplatonic fashion, the one is something that has to manifest in the many. And for Baudin, this is obvious through the observation of the natural world, where all around us we see differentiation as a metaphysical principle. So for Baudin, he's not espousing a kind of deism where he's saying that the particularities don't matter. Even if he does believe that ultimately religions have the same esoteric truth at their core, that's by no means an invitation to abandon the exterior trappings. If anything, he believes exactly the opposite. I would say that Baudin is actually really a kind of proto-traditionalist, in the sense that he certainly has the perennialist grounding there in the idea of partial validity in a multiplicity of religions, but he also really emphasizes the need for tradition and for the if you like, the exterior trapping. That's a slightly negative phrasing, actually, apologies, are actually extremely necessary, because they are what allow people to connect to the transcendent. So as I say, this is a very kind of prototype of what you later see in Guénon. It's really an epistemological condition of human beings that we can only come to know the universal through the particular, which means we need tradition. So even if traditions can be at times superstitious, which is a word that Baudin uses, he is writing in the 16th century, after all, these ideas are very much floating around, even if they are superstitious or superfluous, in the sense that they're not essential to the truths that they contain, they're still necessary, because without them, religions lose the social and cultural roots which allow them to flourish. So there's this really quite fascinating quote by Torralba, who is the philosophic naturalist, and even he basically says that those who press the people with a multitude of rites turn religion into superstition. However, those who completely remove all rites overturn all religions from the roots, as the pruner who, taught by his neighbour to cut the superfluous stalks from the vines so that the vines might regrow more abundantly, cuts his own vines down to the ground. So there's this idea that if you do away with tradition and you take this abstract kind of deist view that, God is just a first principle and we can all come to this truth through our minds, then no, you actually end up cutting off the channels through which people can have a relationship with God. And so these things are deemed entirely necessary. Now, they're necessary not just from a political pragmatism point of view. It's far more metaphysical and cosmic than that for Baudin. So for Baudin, the diversity of religious traditions actually is a metaphysical necessity because it reflects the nature of the cosmos. So he's clearly somebody who's quite steeped in this Renaissance idea of sort of the Hermetic interpretation of the microcosm and the macrocosm. He believes, as above, so below. And therefore, if the cosmos is comprised of this vast assembly of opposing and contrasting parts, and which are all slightly different and gradated in unique ways, forming a harmonic whole, religion also has to be like that, which is an absolutely fascinating way of articulating it, I think. And the last line of the colloquium Pentapomes, the Seven Secrets of the Sublime, actually ends on this note of harmony. So Coroneus says, was it Fredericcus? Forget. One of the interlocutors says, "How good and pleasing it is for brothers to live in unity, arranged not in common diatonics or chromatics, but in enharmonics, with a certain more divine modulation." So in this musical imagery, there's the idea that you actually need difference, because, for example, with a musical chord, the whole nature of a musical chord is its opposing parts coming together, being mediated by a middle note. You need difference, and that's the divine modulation he's talking about. So this is a summation of this as above, so below idea, the idea that if there's harmony in the cosmos, then there's necessarily harmony and therefore differentiation when it comes to religious belief. And it's also deeply related to this harmony of the spheres idea in Plato. Now, Baudin has another work where he also touches on this idea of harmony and the need for multiplicity in all things on earth, in a work called The Theatre of Nature. And there's a great commentary on this by a scholar called Anne Blair, which I really recommend. So in The Theatre of Nature, Baudin talks about Plato's Timaeus, and uses this to show how the cosmos is comprised of musical ratios. And basically, again, this idea that you can't have harmony without a diverse range of notes. If you had all just one note, then you wouldn't have harmony. It would just be boring. And likewise, if you have too many clashing notes, if there's not a sort of organization of differentiation, then that also creates a kind of dissonance. And Baudin is very concerned about dissonance at both a metaphysical and political level, and I'll come to that very shortly. Because when harmony is disturbed, the resultant cacophony of the sense of the sounds, he says, offends the delicate senses of wiser men who are all seeking for this harmonic unity. So for Baudin, it's basically the duty of the wise, and this is conveyed quite subtly in the colloquium, to preserve the euphony of difference and to avoid both dissonance and artificial homogeneity, which in other words is syncretism. If you make everybody play the same note, then you're not only forcing people to behave in a way which is against their disposition, because we all have different modes of expression and viewing the world slightly. If you do away with that and you end up with an artificial kind of unity or homogeneity, you precisely lose that harmony that's so essential to the world. So this is a way of articulating religious pluralism, which is I mean, well, it's on a cosmic scale, really. It links the diversity and differentiation among people to that in the cosmos as a whole. So harmony is an extremely important concept for His Majesty. It's the title of his book, in fact, and I'll share some more on that. So Baudin believes that, following this musical analogy, that true religion must be tolerant, for it sees the harmonious multiplicity of all religions. So that's from Kuntz's commentary on the colloquium. So in a sense, Baudin is bridging this Neoplatonic metaphysics of unity with the urgent political need to resolve violent conflicts of post-Reformation Europe. So he's by no means articulating this simply for that reason. He's not just sort of making this theory up. He's tying it to what he believes is the fundamental nature of the cosmos. It's all about differentiation, and you need differentiation to create harmony. So this is not just the case with religion, but it's also the case with justice. He sees harmony as being the ultimate kind of justice, and also nature. And he talks a lot about this in the theatre of nature, where he demonstrates how the natural world is really the summation of opposite elements being unified through intermediaries, just like you have, as I said, with the chord analogy, you have a middle note bringing together two notes, contrasting notes into a kind of unity. So to give an example that he gives in the theatre of nature, the elements of earth and plants, they are mediated by truffles, and stones, plants and stones are mediated by coral, and metals and stones are mediated by pyrite. So you see these kind of middle elements, because coral is kind of halfway between plants and stones, and so he draws this incredible map of the natural world to show how it's all about differentiation producing harmony, and therefore it's the many participating in the one, more conceptually. So Baudin's view on harmony is that it's essential to all aspects of life on Earth, and this is of course one which is shared by His Majesty. So he wrote a book co-authored with Ian Skelly, who's the chair at Temenos Academy, and Tony Juniper, and it's called Harmony, A New Way of Looking at Our World. And in this book, they present the idea of harmony as being really the grounding principle of everything when it comes to nature, economics, social relations. This is really, really His Majesty's guiding principle, if you like. And in that book, he talks about how this links to biodiversity, for example, saying that harmony between people and the rest of nature is not simply a philosophical or theoretical or ethical matter. It is a fundamental, practical, and economic priority. And in the same book, he also says, having discussed the concept of harmony as it occurs throughout the Western tradition, and indeed Eastern tradition as well, he says that tracing this golden thread of wisdom and the inner need to maintain harmony in the world and within ourselves demonstrates how beautifully this principle has been woven into the fabric of Western civilization. Clearly, the idea is not some wishy-washy New Age invention of the late 20th century. Far from it. It is a very precise principle indeed, acknowledged as central by some of the greatest thinkers the world has ever seen, from Pythagoras and Plato to Shakespeare and Ficino, from Giorgione, Bach and Handel to Wordsworth, Poussin and Blake. All of these great artists were very clear that there is a harmony to the world that must be maintained. So, in practice, what does harmony look like? How do we bring about harmony? Well, the natural world, His Majesty clearly has plenty of ideas, but what about socially? How do you bring about this social harmony? Well, conveniently, Baudin himself was an absolute monarchist, and he tells us exactly how a sovereign ought to implement social harmony. And I would say this actually does seem to resonate quite strongly with His Majesty's. I've got an absurdly long quote here, sorry. He says that the king, so this is Baudin, not His Majesty, says that the king must himself maintain one religion. So king cannot ideally be practicing multiple religions. He can't be a kind of syncretist. And he should ideally promote this religion, he should officially maintain this religion alone, so not to confuse his subjects or partake in a kind of syncretism which undermines his tradition with a capital T. However, where the population is diverse, the king Baudin says, actually needs to be tolerant of religious difference and not attempt to coerce people. Now, the reason for this, and in general his defense of religious freedom, is a pragmatic one politically, but it also ties into his metaphysical views of harmony, is that if you try and coerce people into believing this exactly the same thing as the sovereign believes, and everybody to have exactly the same religion, especially in a society which is already diverse, it will simply just lead to conflicts and division and disharmony. And that's really key for Baudin. He says the ultimate thing you cannot do is create disharmony. And he actually fears that kind of disharmony, where people are forced to practice a religion which they don't in their hearts believe or does not culturally relate to them, it will most likely just lead to atheism, because they will lose their means through which they practice worshipping. And so for Baudin, that is actually the greater evil. Non-belief is ultimately what we have to avoid. And this is certainly paradoxically what actually justifies his very, very strong promotion of religious freedom of conscience. So this is, believe it or not, this is actually a very trimmed down passage from 6 Books of the Commonwealth, which is another of Baudin's books, where he talks a lot about monarchy and religion and harmony. He says that even atheists agree that nothing so tends to the preservation of commonwealth as religion. I am not concerned here with what form of religion is the best. There is in fact only one religion, one truth, one divine law proceeding from the mouth of God himself, very proto-perennialist. But if the prince who has assurance of the true religion wishes to convert his subjects, split by sects and factions, he should not, in my opinion, attempt to coerce them. The more one tries to constrain men's wills, the more obstinate they become. But if the prince in his own person follows the true religion without hypocrisy or deceit, without any use of force or any infliction of punishments, he may turn his subjects' hearts. In doing this, not only does he escape unrest, trouble, and civil strife, but he guides his errant subjects to the gates of salvation. Those who are prevented from the exercise of their own religion and not in sympathy with any other end up by becoming atheists, as we know. Once they have lost the fear of God, they trample underfoot the law and the magistrate and give themselves over to every sort of impiety and wickedness, beyond the power of any human laws to remedy. And just as the cruelest tyranny does not make for so much wretchedness as anarchy, where neither prince nor magistrate is recognised, so the most fantastic superstition in the world is not so nearly so detestable as atheism. One must therefore avoid the greater evil if one cannot establish the true religion. So strong words from Baudin. He's quite a Platonicist. So interpreting it in light of this, Baudin's proto-perennialism, if you like, and this proto-perennialist paradigm of pluralism, far from representing an indifference towards religious belief, which we see in the more liberal secular paradigm. It's just sort of like, let people believe what they want. We shouldn't be enforcing any particular idea or any religion. It's actually really about the preservation of religious belief. Pluralism is really about the prevention of non-belief. By allowing religious difference, which as per this Neoplatonic principle of unity and multiplicity is both inevitable and essential for cosmic harmony, individuals and communities are able to maintain their own particular ways of connecting to the transcendent. So again, very pro-tradition, pro the preservation of the means which societies and communities have built to connect to the divine. As Baudin says previously, if people are forced to renounce these ways through persecution or mass conversion, they will likely end up being severed from God altogether. And this, for Baudin, would be the worst outcome of all. And again, warning against this in the theatre of nature, he writes quite poetically that the fervent love and honour of God has become so lukewarm and cold from the succession of time that there is a danger that in the end it will freeze over. So, for Baudin, it is the duty of a monarch to advocate for religious freedom and pluralism, because it maximally ensures that the populace, who are inevitably bound to be diverse in their dispositions, can love and worship God. But I think it's important to just emphasize once again that there is still a meta-exclusivism underlying this pluralism. And Baudin does not believe that anybody should be able to practice any form of religion. Actually, very infamously, he does not think that. He extremely condemned these beliefs which he believed were kind of wicked and creating societal evil and turning people away from God, such as witchcraft. He wrote a very notorious treatise called On the Demon Mania of Witches, in which he said that witches were fundamentally a threat because they were destabilizing society. This book got a lot of flack because some thought that it was responsible for however many witch burnings. This since turned out to not be that influential at all, and it probably didn't really have that much influence. It's slightly mad. But the reason I mention that is because I think that when reading the colloquium, you might be left with the impression that he is a kind of a relativist, really, in saying that, let people believe what they want to believe, or rather that's a very sort of half kind of general impression that one might get having heard of the concept. But no, he's actually very meta-exclusivistic in the sense that he believes there is ultimately one religion, one true religion, and deviation from that can be dangerous. But nonetheless, within that religion, there is pluralism. And this is all part of the idea of harmony. So, I've covered quite a lot of ground there. So I want to just go over what this perennialist paradigm of pluralism is on the terms of Nicholas Cusa, Ficino, and Baudin. So before I go into that, I think having discussed all of this, I think we can start to see a more subtle dimension in what His Majesty means when he talks about defence of faith. Because on Baudin's logic, by promoting pluralism, it's actually really preserving the particular channels through which different communities can connect to the divine. And so through doing that, you are able to defend faith per se, in theory. And I think this is something which is surely commendable in an age where, as Baudin feared, you might say that the universal love of God is indeed freezing over. So to summarize then, we can say that this perennialist paradigm of pluralism has the following 5 features, and these are, I suppose, fairly common to both to Cusa, to Ficino, and Baudin, and indeed also Guénon, Gion, and the traditionalists. So the first is this esoteric view of unity, one light, one thread, one true religion. The second is a recognition of the diversity in the manifestations of that religion. Third is the celebration of tradition as that which keeps the roots of faith grounded in particular contexts, which then entails a rejection of syncretism. Fourth, the subsequent promotion of religious pluralism and freedom. And 5, ultimately the avoidance of atheism and non-belief. So how does that compare to a more modern paradigm of religious pluralism? Because this is something which people are often talking about, especially with the recent census data, which reveals that Christians are now, considerably lower percentage of the population than ever before. There's a clear rise of other religions such as Islam, Hinduism. And I think the most common response to that is to move towards more of a kind of relativism, which tries to stay out of religion altogether. The perennialist paradigm, on the contrary, maintains a conception of absolute truth. This is why I think it's one thing to sort of, the key point here is that even though there is a relativity of expression, as we saw in the prism analogy, it does maintain this conception of one ultimate truth. Now, as I say, this is really diametrically opposed to a modern paradigm of pluralism, which is often premised precisely on the rejection of any notion of absolute truth. In the modern era, the confrontation with the plurality of cultures, traditions, opinions, ways of life has more often than not tended to render the conclusion that there is no objective truth. There can be nothing that unites people, or that it's all a matter of perspective, which is ultimately leading to the idea that there can be no truth. And I think this is perhaps most succinctly summarized by a quote from Nietzsche in Will to Power, where he says that there are various eyes, even the Sphinx has eyes, and as a result, there are various truths, and as a result, there is no truth. So you can see how pluralism can often slip into relativism, which ultimately then slips into basically a negation of any idea that there is any absolute truth, which is unsurprising, because if you think philosophically about this, the modern world, as Lee Braver has argued quite interestingly, both Enlightenment and postmodern philosophy are essentially defined by a rejection of Platonic realism and the idea of an ultimate truth outside of our minds, if you like to use the Augustinian terms. And so it follows that modern subjects fail to recognize they fail to recognize particulars as participating in universals, which leads to this view that you just have an array of various different arbitrary opinions, which are not participating in any ultimate truth, but they're simply construction. Social constructs is the word of choice. So as a result of that, modern pluralism, for all of its celebration of diversity, doesn't tend to do so in a sense that points to an ultimate unity. This Neoplatonic idea that many can participate in one is more or less just gone and is sort of gone from our vocabulary. Instead, it's really based on this notion that there actually are no higher truths, no ideals, and thus everybody should just be free to live out their own personal desires, or in true postmodern fashion, my truth. So there's a really fundamental contrast here, basically, between a perennialist paradigm of pluralism, which still maintains absolute truth, and a modern relativist paradigm, which is really premised on its negation. I want to argue that perennialism is arguably a philosophy which is fit for a king. And I say that in light of Bourdain, who talks a great deal about the role of the monarch in diverse societies and how religious difference should be handled. And I think that's a question that, even outside of the divinity faculty, is really on a lot of people's minds. I mean, in my own work, I work in religion and politics, and there's always this question of how do we deal with religious difference in a sensitive way. And so I want to entertain the idea that all of the principles we've discussed about pluralism, multiplicity, unity, are actually in theory quite compatible with a monarch in the 21st century. So just to kind of go over what are the options for pluralism in a religiously diverse society. So where we are now in a very demographically diverse country, the easiest option for most of our leaders is just to avoid matters of religion altogether, and celebrate it maybe just as a marker of cultural diversity or difference, as opposed to something which points to the transcendent. This arguably only really furthers this kind of indifference or freezing over of faith. It just sees faith as being something which is purely kind of cultural artifact, and is more interested in that rather than what faith represents. And so by completely staying out of religious ideas altogether and going for a sort of muscular kind of secularism, that's the end result, really. So what are the alternatives to this? So one would be to impose traditional Anglicanism, and this is the preference of many conservative monarchists, and completely cease to endorse other traditions. They say this isn't traditional, pluralism is a uniquely modern phenomenon, and the monarch should not engage with it. The monarch should solely represent the Church of England. The problem with this, as Bourdain says, is that it actually could well just cause more division, disharmony, and ultimately disbelief, because if you exclude and you coerce people, then you're actually really severing them from their traditions and therefore the means through which they connect to the divine. And I mean, just practically, this would just simply not work in today's day and age, where these issues of representation are just so at the forefront of all of these conversations. Another approach would be to take what you might call a universalist approach, which treats all spiritual systems as just being one and the same, and takes that as an invitation for syncretism. So, as I said before, the merging and mixing of all different religions. And this is sometimes called in conspiratorial circles a one-world religion, which many people fear is the impending reality, where we have interfaith dialogue, which actually fails to respect the boundaries of different religious traditions, and therefore potentially leads to some kind of ultra-syncretic, universal religion. Now, the problem with this is that this also is just as likely to lead to non-belief, precisely because it does away with the traditional the particular forms of worship which are essential to religious tradition. And this is why Guénon, despite lots of misperceptions, misunderstandings rather about Guénon's own views and the way he's often framed as a kind of sort of New Age, sort of post-Christian thinker. He was extremely critical of syncretism and said that this is also another symptom of modernity. So we've got three options here, that none of which really seem to defend faith, really, do they? Because on the one hand, you remain indifferent towards it, you leave faith out of public life. If you do celebrate it, you do so purely as a sort of extension of cultural diversity and don't engage with the actual teachings of religion. You could, as we said, impose the traditional Christianity, but again, that would also probably turn people away and cause civil strife, which would just in turn create more disbelief. Or you create this ultra-syncretic one-world religion, which also does not do justice to the traditions that people have in their societies, which connect them to the divine. So a broadly perennialist viewpoint, as we've discussed, is in some ways a kind of antidote to these. I'm not saying this is necessarily what I would enforce, but I think it's worth entertaining in the sense that perennialism, it maintains a commitment to the idea that there is true religion, and there is a conception of absolute truth at the core of this perennialist philosophy, but it also welcomes a diversity of expression. So in this sense, I would argue, a bit like Baudin, that it's actually the ideal philosophy for a king whose duty is both to defend the faith, but also in Platonic terms, to represent the one among the many, to assert the existence of an absolute truth, whilst also recognizing the multiple forms that it can take. So in this sense, and I will end very shortly, I think perennialism potentially represents a kind of alternative modernity. And I'm sort of, I think it was John Milbank who originally used that phrase with reference to Charles. So I am indebted to him for giving me the idea for this particular tangent. But so perennialism, which as we've seen, does have its origins in this Renaissance tradition of Nicholas Cusa, Marsilio Ficino, and of course, Jean Baudin, can be thought to represent a sort of different vision for modernity and how we deal with such a vast degree of pluralism and social difference. And it's one which is able to work with that plurality of beliefs and cultures, but also is able to maintain a conception of absolute truth. And therefore, one in theory which retains as Guénon says, a vertical dimension which connects human societies to the transcendent. It also places, as we've seen, a great deal of emphasis on harmony, not just as a metaphysical concept, but also as an environmental, social, and economic one. And considering that His Majesty sees disharmony as being a fundamental characteristic of modernity, as he says in his book of the same name, it could be seen as a way of looking at the world which might provide an antidote. It's a vision of harmony and how harmony might work in society, and again, how the many might work to realize the one. So of course, it's hard to tell exactly what this might look like. I will reiterate that all of this has been purely speculative. I can't guarantee that His Majesty will embody Jean Baudin's ideal perennialist Platonist sovereign. But I think judging by his actions, for example, the fact that he held a meeting with faith leaders just 2 weeks after the death of his mother, shows that he is really intent on restoring harmony in society and ultimately affirming the importance of faith and the role that it plays. And I will just end with a quote from this meeting he had with faith leaders back in September. "The beliefs that flourish in and contribute to our richly diverse society differ. They and our society can only thrive through a clear collective commitment to those vital principles of freedom of conscience, generosity of spirit, and care for others, which are, to me, the essence of our nationhood. I am determined, as King, to preserve and promote those principles across all communities, for all beliefs, with all my heart." Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Esmé, for your most illuminating account of our philosopher king. There's one name that one might naturally associate with the king in relation to his thought, who in a way is connected to the tradition you've mentioned, but is quite a different figure in her own right. I think of Kathleen Raine. I wonder if you could say something about Kathleen Raine.
Well, of course, Kathleen Raine was involved in the founding of the Temenos Academy. And I think is actually, if I remember rightly, every Temenos Academy meeting, and they light a candle, which is, I think, I'm looking at Dan Sam because he will know that it's partly a memorial to Kathleen Raine. And for those who missed it, the Temenos Academy is His Majesty's, or was. I'm not sure exactly whether he's still officially the patron, but as Prince of Wales, he was the patron. I mean, I think in terms of his engagement with Platonism, he certainly has been very involved in the kind of literary and artistic manifestations of the Platonic tradition. So Kathleen Raine is, of course, someone who's very much at the forefront of Temenos and her relationship with Platonism, but also trying to think who else is a big kind of influence in the Temenos world. I suppose Blake as well, and the sort of British tradition. Yeah.
Questions for Esmé?
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I have two questions that both related to the origin of the perennialist tradition, because as far as I understood it, you said that it can be traced back to the Renaissance, and you have shown us quotes that demonstrate that very clearly. But I think it goes back much further. So the very same idea, notions, and even terms can be found in late antiquity among the Neoplatonists. Most obviously, for example, Damascus employs a lot of those ideas. Proclus has them, Iamblichus has them. So why stop there and portray the Renaissance thinkers as the originators? And then my second question, if you take perennialism seriously and try to argue from the inner framework, like from the perspective of perennialism, it needs to go back necessarily even back further to time immemorial, because basically everyone who had insight into truth, who understood the divine unity, must have also grasped that those pluralist realities go back to the same divine source. So basically every sophisticated priest from time immemorial must have understood it in the same way. If you could say a bit on this.
Yeah, so I think with regard to the first question, why do I start with the Renaissance? I mean, I think in all three cases, well, particularly Cusa and Baudin, they are articulating these ideas explicitly in response to a crisis or a perceived kind of crisis of culture. So for Anarchist Cusa, he's responding to the fall of Constantinople, where there's big questions about Islam, one of the first, I guess, clash of civilizations in the West, one of the most major kind of point at which we had to really start asking ourselves sort of what is our relationship to the other. And of course with Baudin as well, and he's writing in a time of extreme sectarian conflict. I chose those two and in general that period really because I think the fact that they are articulating their perennialism in response to a heightened moment of pluralism, I think is extremely relevant, because right now, the king is going to have his coronation at a time where, as the census reveals, it's an incredibly culturally diverse moment. So I suppose that was why it was more to keep it within the scope of relevance. And with regard to your second point, was there a specific question within that?
Yes, whether you agree that, in fact, if you take perennialism seriously, you need to predate the idea to the basically earliest times. So every prophet must have understood it is a true prophet in that sense, as such.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose Islam to some degree, and maybe this is one of the reasons why Guénon was drawn to it, but I actually don't know in great depth the story of his conversion. Actually, I suppose in Islam there is certainly this very clear sense that the Jewish and Christian traditions are somehow partially true. I mean, I certainly not kind of perennialism, but I suppose in terms of prophecy, yes, you're right that in theory prophets of major world religions would have this idea in some way. I think with Christianity, and I possibly should have mentioned this earlier on, I think trying to reconcile Christianity and perennialism obviously opens up a huge can of worms, because you only come to the Father through the Son. That's made very, very clear in the Bible. And so I think that does tend to be why you do tend to get more Muslim perennialists in general than Christian perennialists, just from my experience anyway, because it's so difficult to reconcile. But anyway.
So Julian, and then,
So, thank you for your talk, Esmé. My question is actually sort of on that, the question of, in a Christian context, how does this sort of play out? So I guess I'm curious about if you have any thoughts about, in Christianity, the idea of conversion is of paramount importance, right? And that there's kind of an exclusivity to Christian belief about sort of, as you said, sort of the only way to God is through Jesus Christ. So how does something like conversion play out, you think, in in these thinkers that you mentioned who seem to be Christians, do they have thoughts about, you know, how like, do you can go out and convert sort of these other these people who practice other religions, or is there something that is maybe not desirable about that?
I mean, I think I'll go to Nicholas of Cusa because I think he kind of answers that question for you in a way. Really, for Cusa, the ideal religion, as you allude to there, is Christianity, and there is not a shadow of a doubt about that for Cusa. But really, if you are going to try and convince other people of that reality for Cusa, much like with Baudin, you can't do it through coercion, because the whole justification of perennialism is that the any truth that is shared is deeply esoteric, and so you can't simply force people to convert if they don't kind of understand that ultimate similarity between their own faith and Christianity, and see Christianity as being perhaps a perfected form of that faith. So I think for Cusa, and indeed all of these thinkers, I think would encourage not forcing conversion by any means, but more reasoning. I think it's all this whole notion of an esoteric unity of religion is something which can only be discerned through the intellect, and that's actually the ulterior motive for all of these dialogues, is to try and draw out that actually Christianity is the kind of perfected form of religion.
Francesco.
I was wondering about two actually objections that may be placed to a perennialist solution to the malaise of modernity. And one is, what modernity? Because I think that you presented modernity as a time of secularism, essentially. I was thinking of like how, with the word superstition, the superstition for anyone up to probably the early 19th century wasn't disbelief or belief in something silly, but in something demonic or satanic. So when Baudin speaks of superstition, he's thinking of witches and not of, and that's why the reformers were so against superstition, because it was demonic. So, and this endorses an idea of modernity that actually it's, say, people in Britain nowadays, more than 80% believes in something paranormal. Some believe in ghosts, some believes in demons, some believes, and do not overlap as groups. So, and this majority increases with younger generations. So, I wonder how much we live in a secular society and how much not. And therefore, how do you think that this would report with perennialism? And the second thing is, you said that enforcement may lead people to think of a freezing of faith. But after the time of COVID, we saw that it's really easy to explain to people that they need to wash their hands at those times for that amount of time, and they really like it. A lot of people like it very much. They like to enforce behavior. And so, because it shows to them that the state cares, is really important. It's for your salvation of your bodies. And people love, and indeed they report on the neighbors if they don't. So I wonder if enforcing Anglicanism, whichever form one prefers, may actually not be very much liked after first doubt, because it's for their own salvation. So enforcement is really unpopular.
Yeah. Sorry, your first question.
The first one was about how would an understanding of society of actually, with a deep belief in supernatural or the sacred in different forms.
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting contribution to that issue is of course Charles Taylor, who understands secularism not simply as being the lack of belief, but it's rather the vast proliferation of different beliefs which are no longer tied to a kind of social or communal structure. So when you talk about people believing in ghosts and paranormal spirits more than they ever have before, I mean, well, this actually is pretty exclusively a Western trend. It's like UFO sightings are almost exclusively in the West, which is quite funny data. But the point is that these are really products of a society where the religious imagination is still clearly there, but it's thrust into this world where there's no doctrinal certainty or tradition through which to understand and express that belief. So I think the reason why you see all these strange kind of paranormal, spiritual types of ways of looking at the world, it actually is is a result of secularism, because it's precisely the fact that there's no outlet for those spiritual ideas, and so they take these strange forms, and so you end up with what I think Charles Taylor calls a kind of supernova, sort of spiritual supernova, where there are all these different ideas, but it's the lack of something holding them together into a coherent system, which defines what modernity is this very postmodern situation where
lack of enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by enforcement, I suppose, to go to your second question, because Baudin actually in the 6 books on the Commonwealth talks quite a bit about persuasion, and he's blatantly speaking about Plato here and the idea of sophistry, and how do you convince people of something? And it's not through conversion; it has to be through reasoning and through a kind of Socratic drawing out rather than putting in. So I think in terms of enforcing any particular belief system or religion, I think we've seen time and time again that it just simply doesn't. You can't forcefully impose. There has to be a kind of pedagogical mode of persuasion, I suppose.
I can't imagine our clapping the Church of England in quite the way that we were clapping another institution.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Michael. I was late, so I came from another lecture, but what I thought was amazing. My first question is, was it recorded, and can I catch up with it? Yes. Oh, very good. Okay. I have a question, perhaps it's kind of answered there actually. I might have missed it at the beginning, so apologies if I had. I wanted to add to your slide a philosophy fit for a king or theology fit for a king. I would really agree with that. I feel like part of, not Perennialism as an idea, but Perennialism maybe as a social movement, is very interested in tradition against modernity and adhering to traditional forms of hierarchy. I think it's got coded into it, the divine right of kings. So that's what I thought, yeah, it's fit for a king. They believe in the divine right of kings. And general social hierarchies as they believe existed traditionally against the modern breakdown of social hierarchies, perhaps. Do you think there's a space for a perennialism that questions this, that might be a type of perennialism that holds power to account rather than accepts authority and hierarchy as a form of divine structure of the world?
I mean, I think one of your underlying assumptions there, forgive me if I'm wrong, is that authority is necessarily oppressive and corrupt. No, sorry, I didn't mean to. No, but what I mean is, I think in the modern world, you would be quite justified in having that impression, because I think we've had decades of a particular kind of critical theory which is unable to distinguish between different kinds of authority. So, for example, it can't differentiate between a kind of tyrant or a philosopher king, if you like. And this is why Karl Popper's reading of Plato is just so bizarre, because Plato himself differentiates between all these different types of power and authority, and not all of them are tyrannical. So I would say that your question is a valid one to the extent that in the modern world, unfortunately, so much authority is corrupt, and it is about the play of power and indeed the will to power. But I think perennialism represents a completely different kind of authority, and it's wisdom. It places wisdom at the heart of it and tradition. So you can have authorities in perennialism who have, they're not invested in power over the people, but rather they're simply kind of storehouses of knowledge and of wisdom and traditional resources. So it's a kind of intellectual kind of authority, which I don't think needs to be at all. It should not be at all oppressive. As I say, it's a pedagogical kind of.
It should not be. That's a normative statement, and I would agree with you. It should not be. But in our lives, as we experience it, not just in the modern world, but historically, it is. And I think I asked this for very contemporary reasons, because some Muslim scholars, ulama, let's say, who emerge from the perennial school, though they might not see themselves as perennial today, take this with them into their forms of Islam, and today are using some of these ideas to justify tyranny in the Middle East, I might say. of monarchy. So that's kind of where I come from. I think you'd probably tease that out with me anyway. But I'm not making an assumption that authority is bad or power is bad or it must lead to tyranny, or there are not in fact different types or categories of authority, as you say. My question is there a space to hold tradition to account? It's reified.
Well, I think then the question becomes, doesn't it, about what kind of authority is being exercised here. I think the question of abolishing authority altogether, I'm not speaking purely of the perennialist tradition, is basically impossible, because the whole notion is that there is a kind of intellectual kind of, how it's very hard to articulate. Well, I guess the philosopher king kind of ideal, that's necessary. But I agree with what you're saying, because there is a very clear qualitative difference between a kind of authority which is authentically about promoting wisdom and about drawing it out of people, and then a kind which is about forcing it. And so I think challenging authority in that respect, challenging what kind of authority is at play, is it being abused, is it being used to serve really rather worldly ends, is more of a valuable question than can we do away with authority altogether?
Because we have authority, of course, we need authority in the natural sciences. I mean, without peer review, without an authority based on competence and excellence, then society would fall to pieces. We have a number of questions coming up. So we have, so if you could, at the back, and then we've also got an online question. I'm just not sure how we can.
I will unmute.
You're on. Okay, good. So, please.
Thank you, Esmé. So I've learned a lot from this talk. It's been wonderful. I was wondering about whether there's more options here than on this particular side. It's quite up. Because it seems that internal to religions, established religions, particularly ones that have had to coexist, either in minority or as majority religions in a given state throughout history, they have codes for how one might go about coexisting. In Islam, for instance, but also in Christianity. And I wonder, and of course, none of us here as a minimal critique want to concede whatever sort of evaluative advantage there would be in terms of religious conflict, for instance, or inter-religious conflict, to secular modes of formalistic, bare harm reduction, that kind of business. We don't want to do that. But I'm not sure that, what I'm saying is, do you think that there is a scope here in this Pluralist philosophy to have an internal regulation of religious conflict from within a particular reason itself? Because it seems that the shell kernel thing that there's a shell kernel precipice here, which seems to me just a recapitulation of the priority of philosophy over religion, you see, or which is really sort of in its etuate form is just secularism. So what is going on here in terms of, is traditional Anglicanism fit to internally regulate religious conflict?
That's a really good question, and I agree that there is a risk that you are then privileging a kind of Bodanian natural philosophy over theological traditions. I think the question of Anglicanism is possibly something to speak more about later, and I feel like Sebastian probably has plenty of thoughts on this and is much more well versed in how that might work based on historical example. I mean, the question of Islam, for example, I'm going to mention this because it's something that I'm working on in my job at the moment, and it actually happens to be quite a good example of what you're asking for. So in Islam, in the Islamic tradition, there was in a slightly kind of Orientalist way, something called a constitution of Medina, which was an agreement drawn up by the Prophet Muhammad to basically ensure the fair treatment of Jews and Christians and people of the book, which is. It has been since justified on the terms of the Quran, and trying to seek the grounds for religious tolerance within scripture, which I agree would probably be more of the ideal, because I think let's not kid ourselves. I mean, Baudin, yes, is clearly a very pre-modern thinker steeped in Neoplatonic and Hermetic ideas, but he is also clearly an emerging modern thinker, in the sense that he is somebody who is very slightly starting to see the world through these covertly more rationalistic, but in a kind of Renaissance way, which becomes very hard to distinguish from an authentic kind of Platonic. Because I mean, if you look at Baudin's interpretation on the Timaeus, it's this very interesting hybrid between taking the Timaeus in a very literal way, which seems true to its ancient cosmology, but while also being quite rationalistic about how it. So I will say that as a kind of caveat that these thinkers are always kind of veering towards modernity. So yes, I think to ensure that it doesn't become just a kind of rationalistic philosophical program of allowing religious diversity, I think there is a need for it to be located within particular traditions, and I think seeking how we might do that in a Christian context, which should in theory be the most easy, because all of these ideas are emerging from Christianity, so there is scriptural ground for it. But yeah, it'd be good to talk more about that.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, I think, and that is from our online audience.
Hello, Esmé. This is Kaleem from greetings from snowy Canada. Well done on covering so much in your presentation. I was wondering, you presented His Majesty's thought and philosophy as quite, as a follower of René Guénon's traditionalism. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about, are there any indications you see of divergence from the traditionalist school or René Guénon, particularly perhaps, I'm thinking not of, being an Anglican or versus a Sufi Muslim, although perhaps that might be implicated, but more at the philosophical level, and particularly perhaps in their approach to modernity or post-modernity or changed circumstances. But do you see him as a sort of full student, or is he, divergent or an innovator or in any respect? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think in the case of Guénon himself, and certainly many of his followers, the approach tends to be a very, well, I think say reactionary and quite isolating sort of move away from modern society. And what I mean by that is they tend to kind of go off and sort of try as best as they can to live a private life, rejecting all the social structures, seeing all of them as being, under the spell of the Kali Yuga, and like refuse to engage with any aspect of modern life. In His Majesty's case, he's clearly not doing that. In fact, possibly quite the opposite. He's clearly working with existing institutions. I mean, he's in the monarchy. He's clearly not rejecting in a kind of destructive way the society that does exist, which I mean, on honest, sort of my own personal opinion, I think can actually be extremely dangerous if you just say, well, everything is fallen, and we have to isolate ourselves away from it. So in that respect, I think that's clearly somewhere that His Majesty does diverge from Guénon and the traditionalist school. I think does that help answer your question?
Well, I hope it does, because we
yes,
So let us thank Esmé for giving us absolutely